Hi, I'm here with Gavin Baddeley, who is a author and consultant of horror, and in Abertoir he just did a talk on what makes a horror film, so I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. Right, over to you, Gavin. How would you personally define what horror is?
I think, as I made clear during the talk, unless there's been some kind of EU directive that's been established without my knowledge, it doesn't really matter what I say. Nobody gets to decide these things. So there's inevitably an element of personal bigotry, if you like, involved in my particular definitions. And the only thing I can say in my defence is I'm a lifelong horror fan. So it sort of does run in the blood. And for me, the crucial element is an element of the fantastic, something that's improbable, if not impossible. And classically, that's something like elements of the supernatural, ghosts, vampires, ghoulies and long-legged beasties and so forth. It can also, however, be speculative science, so archetypally, Baron Frankenstein flicking the switch and bringing the monster to life, which is sort of something which is, plausible just about, though I suspect impossible with current science. So I'd say that also qualifies. And the third element, which is perhaps the dodgiest, the one that sort of allows me to pull in a few sort of fringe elements that are called horror films, is a psychological aberration. The idea that madness, if you experience something inexplicable, something bizarre, it doesn't really matter if it's sort of motivated by demonic forces or it's actually coming from inside your head. The effect is the same, and so a certain level of crazy psychological aberration is allowed in there. I mean, for example, Edgar Allan Poe, I think almost everyone describes him as a horror author, or at least a Gothic novelist, a Gothic story, Gothic writer. But there's very few supernatural elements or overtly supernatural elements in Poe's stuff. It's almost always sort of what's going on in the crazy chambers of the brain.
Yeah.
So, that would be my definition. And I think part of the reason for my talk was a kind of rant about the number of these, I think, dreadful, grotty thrillers we've got saddled with. I think that horror's become the junkyard, the genre junkyard. And in some ways that's good, because you find all sorts of great stuff in junkyards. In other ways you occasionally find yourself getting increasingly frustrated because you're just thinking they know we'll watch bloody anything. And so we're getting all these terrible hour and a half of somebody being tied to a chair and tortured, and it's boring. They've made torture boring. These things are torture to watch. And my lone sort of stand against making any more of these bloody things.
Yep. Okay, that's great. So where do you think the roots of horror actually began?
There are lots of different questions. In my talk, basically I said I thought about this and surrendered fairly early on when I got to 25,000 BC. And obviously don't actually know what's going on there. And one of the original beginning of the talk, and then I decided that there was no way of doing justice to this stuff if I went into that level of detail. But the original start was to look at there's a famous cave painting which is from 15,000 BC. I was also going to bring in the Venus of Willendorf, but the painting that I often call the Sorcerer, which is this guy with no trousers on and what looked like antlers on his head. And classically that's interpreted as being it's a shaman, it's some guy doing some kind of magical a ritual in order to conjure deer or beasts or whatever, and this just reflects the position of the average anthropologist or historian who likes to think of these, whereas I say, mightn't it also be like a sort of Neolithic Freddy Krueger?
Yeah.
So sort of starting from there, and of course, I've no authority to say that. But the guys saying it's a sorcerer have got no authority to say that either, and to add to the confusion, that people are suggesting that actually the interpretation of the original drawing was actually wrong.
Okay.
the antlers were either, there were cracks in the cave or whatever, and he'd drawn it according to what he was expecting to see. But in terms of as a genre, one thing you can say, in an area where almost nothing is written, as far as I'm aware, as a genre, we're talking about 1931, where the Lugosi Dracula and the Karloff Frankenstein come out, and that's when you actually get it as a thing, as a phenomenon. And you have had horror used previously. With the Gothic novel, there was a debate about there being a difference between terror and horror, and terror was good horror. That expanded the mind and was full of suggestion, and horror was bad horror, where it was just disgusting. And the word itself, interestingly enough, comes from it's derived from Latin, as I understand it, and it means It means bristling, principally.
Okay.
So as in, you know, the hairs on the back of your neck.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, so that it can imply from fear. It can also imply from chill. And the idea that horror became disgusting was a comparatively late thing. Originally, the closest analogy is chilling. And I also like to think that part of the way people misunderstand horror is they think people just want to be disgusted or frightened. And that's not quite it. I think there's a wonder involved in true horror fans. I think they get something out of the, you know, and the way in which you describe, you know, music, which somehow ineffably really moves you. You often say it sort of raises the hairs on the back of your neck. And I think good horror does that as well. It's thrilling.
Yes.
You know, it's not, and some of it is just disgusting, but frankly, you know, you can have the same effect by sort of throwing the contents of a butcher's bucket in somebody's face, which is, I'm sure there's some justifications to do that on occasion, but that's not, you know, that's not my idea of entertainment.
Yeah. Okay, that's really great. So you mentioned about Dennis Gifford's book in your talk, and why did that book in particular stand out to you?
There weren't an awful lot of these things about at the time, is one thing to say. I mean, it's like, you know, I feel more and more I'm giving these talks, I think I'm sort of turning into one of these cliched old men from that Monty Python sketch. In my day, we only had one horror book. But it was partially because there were other ones that appeared, but it was the first one that I saw, and it was in the local shop, and you didn't have the internet, so you couldn't be, you know, browsing on Amazon. So at the age of 9 or 8 or whatever it was, you know, seeing this thing was something special. And I think your first horror book, you know, so I can think of several horror analogies there, and I won't pursue any of them, but your first horror book is special. Yeah. And, you know, there were other ones that appeared. There were Alan Frank wrote a load of, produced a lot of these books with lots of big colour pictures from the Hammer films and everything. And because you couldn't see most of these films, you know, occasionally they crop up on the TV, not very often, but aside from that, you couldn't see them. So these pictures were all you knew about. And it's still to this day, it's often strange, I'll be seeing an old, you know, an obscure horror movie for the first time, and I'll just suddenly think, that's that image. You know, and often you'd interpreted it as a kid, you know, and built all sorts of stories around it, and usually the film's you know, it's a piece of crap, but you developed this sort of fascinating story around it. And so, you know, yeah, they were sort of, you know, biblical, they were kind of magical, because, you know, there wasn't anything else to consult.
Yeah, I totally get that, yeah. So would you say you're kind of open-minded when you accept like different subgenres into horror, like more than just the supernatural? You're not open-minded.
Yeah, I like good films. I mean, it's the risk of sounding sort of trite and silly. I do like good films, and if it's a good gangster movie, even a good musical, you know, they do exist.
Johnny X.
Yeah, that was a pleasant surprise. I mean, if it hadn't have been on paper, I didn't really like the look of that, but it was just done with a certain level of charm, and you know, and a sort of certain pizzazz that made it work. I think it's easy to take the position and say things should be as broad as possible and we should embrace everything, and that obviously seems like the positive approach, and in some ways it is. But being the sort of curmudgeonly old contrarian I am, I prefer to turn and say, no, let's close the doors, let's not have any more of this, because a lot of these movies, a lot of the stuff you're seeing, and part of my crusade to kind of, you know, to re-establish some of the parameters comes from going to a lot of festivals and just looking through the programme and just thinking, there's not a horror film on here.
Yeah.
You know, and part of the reason for that is because the stuff, you know, the festival can only pick from what they get, and in many cases they're not, all they're getting are you know, films about people being tied to chairs. There was a certain very famous horror festival earlier this year, and I know one particular high-profile critic actually sort of dubbed it Rape Fest on account of, you know, the content, and people were just saying, I just don't want to sit here watching this, you know, and there can be a context. I wouldn't like to censor anything, but on the other hand, if you want to go and see films about people being sexually assaulted for an hour and a half, you know, fine, but that's not a horror movie, you know, and I don't want to see that, you know, I'm just not interested, you know, it doesn't, I'm not shocked, because if I'm really not enjoying what's on the screen, it's very easy for me to just think, well, okay, there's a guy stood over there with some lights, and, you know, I know it's a film. I choose to enter the realms of the film and let it unnerve me or frighten me, and if the filmmakers pissing me off, then I shut off and I just think you piece of crap.
Yeah.
So so I will defend my bigotry.
Yeah. So which like recent horror titles have impressed you and which haven't so much?
God, I can never remember. They all merge into one. I've seen too many. What have I seen recently? I mean, I've been enjoying a lot of the stuff at Abertoir. I thought Antiviral was very strong, and that's a good case in point of my defence of saying it is improbable to the point of impossibility now, but it's plausible. So I think that does qualify as a horror film. And I thought that was very strong, and also very, very peculiar to think that it's the sort of the Cronenberg taint has obviously passed down the family tree to the benefit of horror film goers everywhere. What else have I seen recently? I quite liked a lot of these haunted house pictures. I'm glad to see those coming back. And funnily enough, my better half, we've been to see them, and I think we've disagreed on almost all of them. So there's one she's seen, and she just thought, I hated that, and I was just thinking, I thought it was really effective. And then the other one, I was saying, oh, that was boring, and it's like, so I wouldn't. I hate Paranormal Activity 1.
Yeah.
And I never cease to be amazed that they made another one, let alone a whole bunch of these bloody
it's
things.
following on the Saw thing now as well as next day.
Yeah.
Saw at Halloween, that's finished, that's Paranormal Activity.
But the first Saw was good.
Yeah, it was.
Whereas the
great
first
film.
Paranormal Activity was awful. I don't like, they call them found shaky cam. Is it more accurate? It's just, there are occasions where it's appropriate, but in most cases, like tying people to chairs, it's because it's cheap.
Yeah.
And it's not, you have to make up a reason why somebody's filming absolutely everything, and the usual go-to reason is because that person is an idiot. An idiot.
Yeah.
That's the kind of person that films absolutely everything. So you're an hour, for an hour and a half of being made to feel faintly sick by motion sickness in the company of a babbling idiot.
I had that experience recently in VHS, as a film I really did not like.
Yes, I know.
That's that again.
I haven't seen that one yet. That's divided people. So I'd certainly say Paranormal Activity stunk. I liked The Innkeepers. I thought that was effective.
Yeah.
I liked Sinister. I liked what was the new one from the man who made House of the Devil? Whatever. But yeah, so I've liked those, and I dislike cynical films as well, because it's a go-to if you want to break into filmmaking. And not everyone. I don't expect everyone who makes a horror movie to be sort of to have Bela Lugosi tattoos and whatever else, but to have a basic knowledge of the genre is the least I would expect from someone. And often the indication of a bad horror movie, is you go in and the dick that made it clearly thinks that everything he's done is so original and shocking and wild and weird, and you're just thinking, I've just seen this done 1,000 times so much better by somebody who has some amount of respect for the audience.
Yeah. We're going to move on now. How significant would you say the Ripper murders have been to horror as a whole?
I think they've been significant to our culture as a whole. I mean, whether it was it's eternally with these sort of historical events. There's two ways of looking at it, and one is that to say that the event itself caused the changes, and the other one is to say that these changes were waiting, were pregnant to happen, and it's just this is the one that happened to be there at the trigger. And I think I think that the stronger evidence is the latter. And so the Ripper murders were very much about. I mean, one of the most significant aspects is the emergence of tabloid journalism. It's the way in which the media now leads how these stories are covered, and we've seen it so many times in recent history with everything from the Madeleine McCann hysteria through to and I'm not saying these crimes would necessarily have been solved if there hadn't have been this demented press and public obsession, but I would say that in my opinion they make it more difficult for the police to do their job and increase the chances of the victim, if she was alive before, not just Madeleine McCann, I mean, in numerous cases if they were alive, before the hysteria, it increases the chance of whoever's abducted them killing them. So I think there's a disgusting cynicism about, and of course Jack the Ripper didn't exist. No. The letters almost certainly were written by a journalist. Yeah. In order to create a story, and there's a different kind of horror there, the cynicism, and I think in a way, again I said in the talk, it's like a parallel term in a way is video nasty.
Of course, yeah.
Because again, video nasty, as far as I can determine, though the press claimed it was a common term amongst, you know, video distributors. As far as, you know, all the research I've done suggested that actually it was made up by a hack. And so it's a distinction between the reality of horror and the fantasy of horror. And for me, the horror I love is all about fantasy. It's about exploring uncomfortable, darkly fascinating things in the safe realms of vampires and castles and stuff like that, and not the kind of, you know, because I mean, you know, I think I've got a strong stomach, but a lot of these media hysterias make me feel faintly sick.
I mean, why do you think they find it easier to blame horror films for crimes? Like, why is that the easier route to take when they're writing a story? Because
they're stupid, I think, is one of the answers. I should elaborate on that, probably, shouldn't I? So, because it's a reasonably bright 7-year-old can make the distinction between fantasy and reality, yeah? And people often don't make that distinction because they don't want to. And so the idea that a film frightens them must mean that film is bad.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like a sort of, you know, kind of an idea you get in a lot of religion and sympathetic magic within the occult, is that the idea that there are these correspondences. And as I think I showed you during the talk I had from the Sun, which had a thing about all these different films they said had caused various crimes. I think it's also partially because, and a lot of those weren't horror films instead, because obviously people watching this won't have necessarily seen that, so it was things like The Thing, but it was also, I think, what else was in there? But also The Shining, but there were some comparatively innocuous. I mean, they did some guy did a survey on serial killers, you know, the idea of what inspired serial killers. And, you know, I think he was expected to find that they all, and lots of them, read porn as adolescents. But there again, if we locked up every adolescent that's encountered porn, then, you know, I think we'd need to build at least a couple more prisons. But the one thing he did discover was there was a slight correlation with John Wayne movies. And but the major one, which didn't surprise me, it might surprise me, is the Bible. Serial killers, you know, that's you know, that's the only one that cropped up a lot. And you could argue, of course, that, you know, these kind of things are meaningless. But I think it's easy to blame horror. Horror's also kind of defenceless because it's always been unfashionable. I mean, it's becoming fashionable now, and I'm not entirely happy about that either, as it turns out. But it's becoming more fashionable, so it's becoming a bit better defended. But for a long time, it was the red-headed stepchild, if I can use that rather politically incorrect. But it was the one that, you know, it was easy for them to take things out of, and they were made by little studios, and the big studios that did make them didn't like them. And so if you're looking for something to blame, try and find something that's got few influential defenders and very little financial muscle to kick back at you. So horror movies were an obvious one to go for. And that's a lot of what the Video Nasties panic was about, was they were an easy scapegoat, and the big studios have been caught hopping by the massive explosion of video technology in the early 80s. And one way of shutting it down was to sort of to bring in all this repressive censorship and so forth.
My final question, excuse me, do you think the BBFC are the enemy, or do you think they are providing a service to protect the film industry?
My suspicion is it rather depends on who you've got in power. So, obviously they always say, because it's easy to forget, as a horror fan in particular, the BBFC in theory are there to serve the film industry. They're there to protect the film industry. And you could almost argue that the Video Nasties panic was an example of what happens if they weren't there. So, you know, this is when the tabloid Rottweilers are let loose on, you know, and start making shit up. And I think recently, you know, over the past 10 years, they've broadly got it right. Because one of the things I personally find irritating are filmmakers who deliberately try and make a splash by producing movies that are absolute rubbish, but they know will generate. They want to be banned, because they know if they're banned, you know, you don't have to spend. No one's going to see it. So just do something awful to a kitten in the film, and then no one will see it. But then the next time they'll remember who, you know, this is, you know, Jim Bob. He made Kitten Massacre 4. You know, he's made a name for himself. Whereas some poor guy who's made a really, really special little gothic chiller set in the Elizabethan era, I'm making all this rubbish up, obviously, you know, can't get a distribution deal. And so it's frustrating for me that people use, and to a certain extent the BBFC are used as a tool. you do have cases where a studio or a distributor will have a film and they'll take it to the BBFC or the equivalent in the States or wherever, and they'll be given a 12.
Yeah.
And they'll go, no, it's much nastier than that. Because they know a lot of people sort of say, 12? I'm not going to go see a horror movie that's a 12. So there are cases of people wanting to increase. And they're a necessary evil, I think, you know, and they have broadly got it right in the past. More recently, as I say, I showed that wonderful picture of the nude lady in the full head Richard Nixon mask.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a movie, Dear God No, which has been having censorship problems.
Great title, though.
It's a wonderful title, and I think, and in their defence, I don't think it's a case of them. I mean, it's a retro, and it is quite shocking, but it's so silly that I don't think people can really get. But that's a sort of, some people have seen a sort of slight sea change, and that maybe. But I mean, they gave a certificate to Serbian film, and I'm convinced. I mean, never met the guys, but I'm convinced the guys behind that never expected this film to be seen outside of a few festivals and then on the underground. I thought they were just going to make a splash, you know.
Yeah.
I think everyone was rather shocked when that appeared in HMV.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for your talk. And you've got a few books out, haven't you? You can get those off Amazon.
You can,
Yeah.
yes.
All good bookshops.
Yes, and some bad ones as
Yeah.
well. Yes.
Great, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Bye.